The Great War over, America emerges bigger and bolder than ever. Women are bolstered by their wartime contributions and are confident they have finally secured their right to vote.
And unfortunately, the women are dismayed when, in the late 19-teens, North Carolina, after the war, is given the opportunity to be the deciding vote on giving women the right to vote. The state just needed to approve it. They would be the final voice. And our politicians decided not to do that. They actually called over to Tennessee, who was next in line, to potentially be the deciding vote and tried to convince them, don't do this. Tennessee did not listen. They voted in support of, and thanks to Tennessee and the other states, women had the right to vote.
Passed by Congress in 1919 and ratified a little over a year later, the 19th Amendment finally secured women a place at the polls. Cherokee, Lumbee, and members of other tribal nations, as well as Black Americans, continue to struggle for that same right.
Politicians put in all these measures legislatively to keep them from voting, or just intimidated them at the polls to turn them away. And so when Wilson asked these folks, the Cherokee and the African Americans and these disenfranchised folks, step up and secure democracy abroad for other nations, they came back from this war thinking, well, now it's our turn to have democracy at home.
With Jim Crow laws enforcing racial segregation in the South, Black American war veterans joined the Great Migration from the rural South to the urban Northeast, Midwest, and West in search of equality and a better life.
The experience of African Americans, and this started in World War I, they saw that in places like France, African Americans were not treated the same as they were back home. And so when they went overseas, and again, when this happened again in World War II, they expect to be treated differently because they have served the country. A lot of these veterans are demanding rights that they feel that they've earned by their service.
For the first time, Black American voices enter mainstream America with creative expression and the birth of a cultural, literary, and artistic Harlem Renaissance. In 1925, the publication The New Negro wrote, "Negro life is seizing upon its first chances for group expression and self-determination." In New Orleans, a distinctive form of musical expression catches fire during the Jazz Age. Radio and cinema contribute to the development of a national identity and an increased awareness of regional cultures. Coast to coast, Americans move toward increased consumerism and consumption. Automobiles, telephones, electrical appliances, and motion pictures transport America into the modern age. The introduction of hire purchase, otherwise known as paying in installments with interest, entices Americans to buy more and borrow more. Buying more creates more jobs in order to make more. By 1920, the majority of the U.S. population lives in urban centers with increased economic opportunities. The nation's wealth more than doubles, making it the richest country in the world. The United States is open for business, and business is booming. Organized crime, massive political corruption, and reckless margin buying permeated the Roaring Twenties. The 18th Amendment establishing prohibition was one attempt at temperance and moderation. Expansion, speculation, and overpricing moved the stock market toward its ultimate tipping point. When Black Tuesday marked the close of the decade, $30 billion vanished into thin air, and the nation's booming economy suddenly stopped. A decade of growth was followed by a decade of despair. President Hoover's concept of rugged individualism meant he had no plans to involve the federal government in direct economic programs, and as a result, America slid into a full-scale depression. Hoover's name became synonymous with failure and hard times. Add to it years of drought, overcultivated land, and the Midwestern Dust Bowl. The United States was on the brink of collapse. The 30s brought a nationwide economic depression, but a new president brought a new way of thinking.
I pledge myself to a new deal for the American people.
Franklin Delano Roosevelt took a proactive approach with his New Deal and massive federal intervention in the country's economic recovery. The New Deal government, or alphabet agencies, were created to bolster our nation's economy. FDR's goal was to put America back to work, provide structure for government-sponsored relief such as employment and welfare, and cultivate a new form of government intervention in the national economy. While America was busy getting back on its feet, trouble was brewing overseas. In 1939, Nazi Germany's three-pronged blitzkrieg of Poland provoked a global conflict. Despite Germany's attempt at a 1-2 punch, the U.S. was not interested in participating in another world war.
The mood of the country was not on a war footing. World War I had really given a resurgence to the isolationist tendency of the United States. So isolationism, American First Party led by people like Charles Lindbergh, was really the predominant political thought of the time.
The United States passed a series of neutrality acts that effectively ended with the Lend-Lease Act in 1941.
Becoming the arsenal of democracy, as FDR talked about it. We entered into the Lend-Lease program with the British, which kick-started the defense industry in the United States and providing munitions to the British before they actually entered the war. This was providing tanks, planes, ammunition.
As a neutral nation, the U.S. would stay out of direct conflict, but would sell, transfer, or lease equipment and arms to nations whose defense the President deemed vital to the defense of our country. On December 7, 1941, that all changed.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. The United States was at peace with that nation, and at the solicitation of Japan, was still in conversation with its government and its emperor, looking toward the maintenance of peace in the Pacific.
Within a few short months, FDR signed Executive Order 9066, authorizing deportation and incarceration of all people of Japanese ancestry from designated military exclusion areas in California, Oregon, Washington, and Arizona. By the spring of 1942, nearly 130,000 Japanese Americans were removed from mainstream society and relocated to internment camps outside the exclusion areas. Between 1941 and 1945, the U.S. participated in the war on all fronts, from the beaches, villages, and towns of Europe to the islands of the South Pacific and Japan. Closer to home, America's coastlines continued to prove vulnerable as German U-boats attacked merchant ships along its shores. Of particular concern was the North Carolina coastal area known as Torpedo Alley or Torpedo Junction.
And there were U-boats sighted all along the coast of North Carolina at different times. The threat was real. So we had a large, what we would call today air defense, but they were coastal artillery. To practice, they would set up their guns on the coastline and they would have a real airplane piloted by a pilot tow the target behind the pilot, and this is the way they had to train. And the coastal artillery would shoot at the target being towed by the airplane. And sometimes these are female pilots because of the lack of male pilots that are actually in combat. So it's a unique story.
The war was far-reaching and touched the lives of every American, from the female factory workers building planes, ships, and tanks, to the families awaiting the safe return of husbands, fathers, and sons, to school children supporting the effort through victory gardens, ration books, and commodities collection. The U.S. threw its entire economic, industrial, scientific, even its creative capabilities behind the war effort.
And then in 1941, you don't have the manpower to man these new factories. So this is a huge turnaround in the economic engine of the United States. The car industry turns into the defense industry. So there's a whole period in the 1940s where GM's not making, you'll have a whole gap in the years of cars where they're making, because they turned into defense industry. They're making tanks and other things. So the whole economy becomes focused on supporting the war effort. And so the lack of manpower shifted towards, there's a lot of opportunities for women to go to work in the workforce, which they had not had before, so that changes some of the dynamics. And also the American ingenuity was on display all the time, not just back at home in the factory, but on the field. And I like to tell, it was a young sergeant that came up and welded a tool to put on the front of that tank, which had been built in the United States. They were having a lot of trouble getting through these hedgerows, and they wanted to figure out a way to get the tank through the hedgerow rather than going over it. So if the tank goes over the hedgerow, its underbelly is exposed to anti-tank weapons. If it can go through it, then the frontal armor, which is most protective, can stay down. So a young sergeant came up with the idea of a plow, and he welded this plow onto the front of this tank, and that Sherman could now plow through those hedgerows in Normandy in France and get through there. And those types of things happened all the time on the front line, just young American soldiers with their civilian backgrounds coming up with ways to either fix equipment, enhance equipment, but drive forward with technological innovations.
There was a band of guys called the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. They were so top secret that their archive wasn't even declassified until the 1980s. These guys were citizen soldiers. They came out of schools of design, they came out of art schools, they came out of radio studios, they came out of places like that. They were not mostly career soldiers. And this included people like the very famous late Expressionist painter Ellsworth Kelly. It included Bill Blass, the clothing designer, included guys from the movies who did special effects. And their job was essentially deception. Deception in battle goes all the way back to the Trojan horse. They were looking for people who were creative. And here's what they would do. They would say you are facing 2 armored divisions and you're trying to mount an attack over here, but you want to make sure those armored divisions stay across the river there. They would get actors and dress them up like General whoever, well-known generals, Bradley, Patton, whoever. But the guy might be a private in real life. But there he is in a Jeep with 3 guards and a headquarters flag and an entourage, and they go into a farmhouse and they set up, very garishly, they set up a headquarters, knowing that the so-called line crossers, which these are guys that come back and forth at night and spy, are going to say, General Patton's here, what are we going to do about that? He must be getting ready to do something. And then they would get on the radio. They created radio scripts because they had script writers from NBC Radio and Hollywood or whatever. And the scripts would be people reading the stuff in, pretending to be a bunch of tank columns coming up to this rendezvous point. And then at nighttime, on their side of the river, they would roll these half-tracks up, which had these gigantic speakers mounted on them. And the sonic platoon would begin to broadcast tapes which were made many months back of tanks rolling into position, the creek, and it would be sergeants shouting and swearing, it would be trucks backing in, it would be the hammering of steel on steel, which would be bridge construction. Then in the morning the sun comes up, and what Bill Blass and his guys have done is they have set up essentially neoprene armored vehicles. They're perfectly crafted to throw the exact same shadows for aerial reconnaissance as a real Sherman tank or a real half-track or a real Jeep or whatever it is, but they're neoprene. They carry 50 of them in the truck, and they have compressors, and all night long they've been blowing them up and then camouflaging them just enough that they can still be seen from across the river. So in the morning, as the sun comes up, after they've been hearing all that operations all night long, after hearing the radio traffic, now the guys look across the river with their field glass. There are tanks there now. There are trucks. They're building. There's half a bridge that they're building. The whole point of this was to influence one guy, which would be the general or the colonel or the commandant, whoever it was that could take those troops out of the line. In one case, they had 2 armored divisions retreat and blow the bridge after them. And it was incredibly dangerous work for this reason. They would invite shelling. They would at nighttime have basically pyrotechnical displays that were built in old empty shell casings and whatnot, firecrackers. And they would mimic being artillery and shooting, knowing that they would get counter battery fire. The other guns across the river would open up. As soon as they did, then the U.S. forces would know exactly where they were and annihilate them with either air strikes or with their own artillery. But meantime, these guys are going to get pounded a while. At one point or another, it occurred to all of them, we're just inviting them to shoot us, to bomb us, you know. But they did it, and so they were extremely brave. They didn't kill anybody, but they put their own lives on the line again and again from D-Day until the end of the war. Talk about citizen soldiers. The guys in the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops were great examples of allowing initiative and creativity really come to the fore in service of the greater good.
They don't participate in D-Day, but they arrive in the continent on June 10th, 1944, and immediately go into combat. And they immediately gain a reputation as a unit that accomplishes its objectives. Roger Casey, a native North Carolinian, actually came to the 30th as a replacement. And Roger will tell you that was luck of the draw. And he looked for the North Carolinians in the unit.
Where is some of the North Carolina boys? I want to see some of them. I want to go meet them, you know. They said, son, they're all gone.
The Battle of Mortain really is their shining moment and cements their reputation as the workhorse of the Western Front.
They held Hill 314, and that was known as one of the major accomplishments of the division.
They absorbed the brunt of almost 6 panzer divisions, and it is Hitler's first real effort at a counterattack that he'll replicate at a place called the Bulge, which is a very famous, the most famous battle of World War II in Europe. But he tries something similar at Mortain to try to break out and help win the battle in France. Well, the 30th is left there because of the confidence that the generals have in that unit to absorb that, while Patton runs around and completes his encirclement. So they buy the time for Patton to be able to do that. Not the most glorious job, but it's that idea of the workhorse, and that's why they get that nickname. They get the tough, dirty jobs and get it done. So they're the 1st Division into Belgium, they're the 1st U.S. Division into the Netherlands, and then they enable 1st Infantry Division to capture the first major German city of Aachen, which is actually the Imperial German capital. Has a lot of significance to the German Reich, and then they're one of the 2 1st divisions to execute a very complicated river crossing as late as March of 1945 across the Rhine River.
The Stars and Stripes are one of the outfits. Having fought the SS there, called us Roosevelt's SS.
So with all that being said, Eisenhower at the end of the war asked his command historian, which is SLA Marshall, to rate all the divisions. So they apparently had 35 historical officers that were assigned. He got them all together, and they looked at all the combat records of those divisions. And then in a report that he issued to Eisenhower, he declared that the 30th Infantry Division was the best infantry division in the European theater of operations.
For many of them, the time in the Army had been one of the highlights of their whole lives because they had met these extraordinary people, they had done this thing, and they didn't really know the extent of what they had done because it was a secret and they often worked in smaller groups, but they knew it was significant and they had this amazing experience together. And I guess there's nothing like being, in the middle of the night with your buddies when German tanks are coming at you during the Battle of the Bulge to sort of feel that deep sense of camaraderie.
I'll tell you about my brother went to see me one time over in Plowing. We had a good time talking for about a day or so. And he was another division. Well, we got along fine. We just talked about old times, talked about want long before we give out something to talk about. Then I learned that my combat brothers were my real brothers. They were more brothers at that time than my blood brother. My combat brothers were real brothers.
Certainly the modern foundation for the weapon systems that we now use in modern war, the groundwork for all that was laid in World War II.
There are things that came out of that era, that nuclear area, where they were devastating, and some of the things that they're used for, some good things came out of it. Some of those things were in the field of medicine, the use of radiation to treat cancers, chemotherapy, to be able to go beyond x-rays and use CAT scan or MRI capabilities. And then, of course, the nuclear energy, cleaner or more efficient use of energy.
We emerged from World War II setting the stage for the modern world. We were left alone as a superpower that had not been touched by World War II. Europe was devastated. All of the traditional European powers were broke. It was really up to the United States to establish a new world order. And this generation of veterans, some of them are involved in government, others are involved in keeping that economic engine, which is the basis for any type of national power going forward, going and allowing the United States to kind of establish things like the Bretton Woods Agreement and all the other institutions like the United Nations and other organizations that we have today that kind of have set the stage for the world order. And that generation got home from the war. They hung up the uniform, put it in their closet, and got to work and never stopped working.